It's funny because before I do these videos, I practice. And when I practice, that mostly is composed of me talking to myself as I pace around my apartment, which must be so strange to my neighbors and my partner, who wakes up and is just like, "Oh, were you doing lessons with a student?" I'm like, "Yeah, I was definitely talking to not myself." When you're playing against very good opponents, it's hard to take extremely straightforward lines and get paid. When you have aces and you go large bet, large bet, large bet, very often your opponent is either going to show you an extraordinarily strong hand at the top of his range, or he's going to reveal some kind of trap against you. And so a lot of players, when they are new to poker, are like, "Man, I put in so much money with this strong but non-nuts hand, and then I got coolered, and it was just a cooler, and then I got dumpstered on." Not realizing that they could have played their hands in much, much more effective ways that both would have given them a little bit more protection from coolers by getting more information from their opponent's overall hand strength. And they can take kind of a tricky solver-approved mix-up line that extracts more value from their opponents because they're taken into theoretical territory that they've never seen before. Namely, a lot of players don't know how to play after you check back and then raise them on a future street. So today, we're going to look at 3 different lines that solvers like using in polarized betting situations that are pretty tricky, pretty nasty, and really, really good at extracting that extra street of value that you might not have been able to before, simply because your opponent has no idea what you were doing. And usually when people don't know what you're doing, they're going to think that you either have the absolute nuts or nothing. So in this model, the cutoff raises about 28% of hands, pretty standard, and he gets defended by about 25% of hands from the big blind. Very standard GTO defense type ranges with a 2.5 big blind raise size. Post flop, I've given each player a variety of different bet sizes, given the out of position player the ability to donk. And though I initially had this, I don't force this to check out of position and bet in position. So let's take a look at the first idea that I really like, which is the overbet blocker on the turn. So on this flop, let's assume that our opponent checks his entire range to us, which may or may not be true, but generally people are going to be checking a pretty dry 8-high board to us. So it checks, and we can see that we should be checking back about half of the time, and that if we give a solver the ability to bet between 1/3 or 2/3 of the pot, it's fairly indifferent between the two, with a very, very slight preference to 2/3 of the pot. Now, what we've seen from the past is when a solver is indifferent between 2 bet sizes, that means we can simplify the 2 bet sizes to a single bet size with any sizing in between. So in other words, if a solver is indifferent between betting 1/3 and 2/3, instead of using this 2 bet sizing strategy, we can simplify this to 1 bet size as long as it's anywhere in between the continuous spectrum between 1/3 and 2/3. So our opponent checks to us, and let's say we bet 1/3, and then our opponent calls. The turn is a queen. In my opinion, the best cards for us on this board are probably going to be a 2, a jack, and a queen, followed by a king and an ace. The queen, the jack, and the 2 being the cards that we in particularly want to put in overbets. We can see that the 2 is definitely a strong overbet candidate, and that the queen, the jack, and the 10 are all pretty good candidates to overbet. Usually when the card comes lower, or more generally, when the card is low enough so that our opponent can turn a set, we want to pick a smaller sizing. And on the turn when we can have exclusive sets and more exclusive 2 pairs, then we want to pick overbets. So our opponent checks to us on the queen turn, and how should we play? Let's take off the square size proportional to weight, and as we can see, a lot of these queen X hands are mixing between overbets on the turn and then a normal bet sizing. As you can see here, Pio is not completely indifferent between these two and slightly prefers the overbets because now you have turned a low top pair. Now, low top pairs after you bet 1/3 are better to turn than higher top pairs because they're going to be harder for your opponent to hit. When you bet 1/3 on the flop and your opponent floats you, he's going to be floating you with hands that have aces, king, lower middling float, like 7-5 or ace-5 of diamonds. And so when the turn comes a queen, there aren't that many flop floats that actually turn a queen or a jack. Which is also a good reason for you to overbet some of your strong aces, because that means that very often it has also improved your opponent to a second best hand. But for now, let's focus on the queen high turn. So here when you turn a queen, PIOsolver prefers a variety of bet sizes. And when we compare the EV between betting an overbet or betting a 2/3 bet size, we can see that it's pretty close between a bunch of these hands. Queen 9 slightly prefers an overbet. King Queen slightly prefers a normal bet size. So in game, if you slightly overbet or slightly bet 2/3 more than the other, it's not going to be a giant problem. So let's say we bet 2/3 with a hand like Queen 10 or Queen 9. Our opponent calls. The river is, let's say, kind of an effective blank. Again, not a total blank because 4-5 gets there. Our opponent checks. And then, not surprisingly, with these kind of hands, we should now barrel off, right? You turn a queen, you have Queen 9. Yeah, it's got to be the best hand by the river. You're just going to value bet. Pretty standard. However, let's say, instead of betting 2/3, we overbet the turn. So we overbet here. Our opponent calls. And now it's the same 2 of spades blank. Our opponent checks, and now we are going to check back. So the first lesson is, if the more polarized we are on earlier streets, the more polarized we have to be on future streets, right? So if we polarize really strongly on the turn, if we really continue to blast here, very often our opponent is not going to be showing us worse hands, right? If we overbet the turn with a queen, and then we overbet the river with a queen again, our opponent's not going to be calling us with many queens worse than Queen 9, right? Our opponent might actually have folded a lot of his worst hands by then. So what is actually going on? On the turn, when you have a hand like Queen 9, it's pretty close how much value you want to get from it. And you can see that it's pretty close because Queen 9 is a hand that you can overbet, you can bet 2/3 with, and you can check back. It's a hand essentially that is worth 1.5 streets of value, and so you want to play it in such a way that it gets about 1.5 streets. It accomplishes this by either checking back to now bluff catch on the river, overbetting the turn to block the river in order to check back, or sometimes betting 2/3 and 2/3. So across all of the different strategies in runout, Queen 9 and Queen 10 is generally going to be playing for about 1.5 streets of value. So I think it's really interesting that when you have a hand that's pretty close between all of these, Pio actually mixes it up in order to, again, add a mix-up to its overall strategy. So if you are facing this strategy, what effectively happens is when your opponent overbets the turn, and you have a hand like pocket 9 or a hand like 9, when you see the overbet on the turn, you can't just assume that your opponent is hyperpolarized on the turn and then going to hyperpolarize on the river, right? If you make that assumption, maybe with a hand like pocket 9s, you're going to then fold too much to the overbet on the turn, in which case then too many of the other overbet bluffs gain a lot of value. Similarly, if you're trying to hand read your opponent, and you sometimes see a 2/3 bet, and you sometimes see an overbet on the turn, it's again even more maddening to put your opponent on a range here. So I personally, when I'm playing, like to play mix sizings on almost every street, not in every formation. There's still many formations where I just go for, the obvious simplifications, bet a third on the flop, and repeat. But in these kind of spots where it's not too difficult to discern the difference between the 2/3 and the overbet strategy, and just recognize that your hand is a 1.5 streets of value from the turn and beyond, then you can incorporate this 3-pronged, smaller double barrel, overbet blocker, check back to bluff catch the river sequence. So I know the internet hates it when you say, oh, in this position, I can kind of do anything. But indeed, this is a spot where you can overbet for value and you can check back for value, and both are going to be pretty good. Let's say you check back Queen 9, your opponent checks, turn comes a blank, and if your opponent checks to you, yeah, then you can either sometimes go for an overbet on the river. If your opponent checks to you and somehow you have king queen by the river, this should be an overbet. But then you have very, very, very clear value bets here. I mean, you have a lot of clear value bets and bluffs with a lot of parts to your range now after your opponent has shown this much weakness. So that's the first line. Overbet blocking the river with these kind of medium strength hands when you turn these kind of low overpairs. I know that's a very particular formation, but, I'm sure that you can extend the overbet blocker in a lot of other places where you have a 1.5 street hand of value. Most important is to give yourself the permission to have a hand that you can overbet the turn with for value in order to check back the river. Being able to slightly merge your turn overbet range makes it a lot harder on your opponent when he has a hand like pocket 9s or 9-8 again, because then he can't think that you're simply hyperpolarized on the turn and think that you have the nuts or nothing. You sometimes have queen 7 here. And it's really murder when they talk themselves into thinking that you have either 2 pair or an overpair or nothing, and you're just like top pair bad kicker. The second hand I want to talk about is often a strategy that is exclusive to pocket aces, though you can kind of extend it to some other hands like pocket kings or top pair good kicker as well. But just want to say this is something that I often think about when I am holding particularly pocket aces. So 8-6-3 is a board where we don't have a crushing nuts advantage, right? Here, out of position player has 11 combos of 2 pairs and sets. In position player has 10 combos of sets and 2 pair. So it's not a board where we are just rushing to put all of our money in when we have, say, pocket 10s. Another hand that really doesn't want to put it in is pocket 8. Particularly because when you have pocket aces, you're unblocking a lot of your opponent's hands that are going to check raise you with double backdoor. So here on the flop, our opponent checks to us, and we should be checking back aces the majority of the time. In fact, we should also be checking kings slightly more often than not. Both of these hands are hands where, man, if you get raised and your opponent starts to put in the money, you're going to really be making a face, particularly if your opponents aren't check raising you with all sorts of like double backdoors on the flop, if they're not check raising all of their gut shots, if they're passive, they're just calling. When they're raising you here, they often are going to show you 8s, 6s, 3s, and sometimes some weird slow played overpairs pre-flop. But in general, if you just put in aces and kings against like tight, aggressive old man types here, you're going to be making a face, or you're going to, I like to always say, you're going to be clenching your sphincter when the money goes in. And generally, if you're doing that a lot against players who are on the tight end, yeah, you're not going to be putting in the money in good. Additionally, when you have pocket aces, you block a lot of your hands that your opponent is going to call you down with. Namely, when I bet here, the hand that wants to call me down the most is going to be ace-8, and I've now blocked that, right? However, when I have pocket queens and I go bet, my opponent can have ace-8 all day. Also, hands like 9s, 10s, jacks, and queens really like betting the flop because they stand a lot more protection, while aces can check back, and it really, really likes allowing its opponent to improve to a second best hand. So, our opponent checks, we check, and the turn is a queen, and our opponent checks to us. We should bet aces most of the time, but generally when the turn is pretty good for us, our opponent checks, there's no reason to continue to pot control, and in fact, the better the turn is for the pre-flop raiser, the more we should bet aces. Here, when we turn an ace and our opponent has checked to us, nothing we can really do, just have to go ahead and bet our set. However, when the turn is low and gives our opponent the ability to turn a set, we should be checking back aces quite a bit of the time. Now let's say our opponent checks, we bet, and we get check raised. Another really, really disgusting spot. It's going to be a spot where I would say we're really, really not happy if we have to put in 3 streets of value, a bet and a raise on the turn, and then a bet on the river. Yeah, we're going to be in a really, really gross spot here. As on the flop, the lower our overpair, the more we should be betting because we unblock our opponent's calling range and our hand stands to need a lot more protection. But aces, again, is a hand where you can check back twice. So we check back, and let's say the river is just, whatever is a non-straight river. Our opponent bets. Guess what? We're now raising with aces. So, similar to the overbet blocker, aces is a hand that really hates to play 3 streets or 4 streets on this board, right? If there's a raise on the flop, a bet, aces is going to be in a kind of a gross spot, right? If you get check raise on the turn and then bet on the river, kind of going to be a gross spot. However, if your opponent leads the river and you raise and your opponent calls, you feel pretty good about your hand, right? Let's say the river's a king. Going to be raising. Here on a 2, which is a 4 out of the straight, even aces considers raising some frequency here. Obviously, the more disconnected the river is, the more that we want to raise aces. So effectively, when you have a hand like aces, which is going to be, again, one of these like 1 or 1.5 street value hands after the turn, you can check back, wait for a good river, and then put in the raise accordingly. If the river comes a 4 straight, becomes really terrible for you and your opponent leads, well, now with aces, kings, queens, if you somehow reach the river with any of these hands, it's a pretty slam dunk call. Especially considering that you're putting in only 1 street of value with aces after you've shown a lot of weakness, which incentivizes your opponent to run a bluff on you. For this last example, let's talk about a cutoff versus button formation where we're going to start with a depolarized flop bet. So the flop comes ace-9-5. We're going to just range bet 1/3. Seems to be probably pretty good on this board. Here we can see that the out of position player has 4 sets and 12 2-pair, so about 16 combos of like effective nuts, we'll say. And the in position player has 25 combinations. So the in position player has all of the high equity hands, probably has more of the raw nuts, can definitely go ahead and start with a range bet on the flop. The opponent calls, and the turn is a 2. Our opponent checks. And now ace-2 is going to be a mixing hand as well. Ace-king, ace-queen, clear overbets. Ace-9, 9's clear overbets. A lot of these kind of like gut shots. Very, very obvious, polarized kind of blasting hands. The problem is when you have ace-2 and ace-5, and you begin blasting here, you're just blocking so many of the hands that your opponents are going to want to call you down with by them. So here you can see if you bet and you shove on the river, the hands that your opponents are going to mostly want to call you with are ace-10, ace-5, ace-2, 5-2, and 2s. If you block all of these hands when you shove on the river, what is your opponent going to call you with? So ace-2 and ace-3 are not hands that you can play as a bet flop, overbet turn, jam river, and expect your opponent's going to really call you with. So very often, you're only going to be able to get 1 more street of value with this turned top and bottom 2 pair. Additionally, realistically, if you overbet this and then your opponent jams on, you're going to see ace-9, ace-5, pocket 9s, and pocket 5s more often than you're going to see a worse hand. So your opponent checks, you check a hand like ace-3. Now let's say the river's like an 8. Your opponent leads, and you have pretty obvious raises with a bunch of your 2-pair type hands. The higher the river is, the less likely your opponent is going to have hit some random set, and the more likely he's going to have hit 2nd and 4th pair as his 2nd pair, so the more you want to raise. So here, when it comes at 8, your opponent can have ace-8, he can have pocket 8s some frequency of the time, so ace-3 is not as clear of a raise. However, if the river is a queen or a king, ace-3 is going to be a very clear raise, because now your opponent can have like king-9. But it's very unlikely that he is somehow going to have improved to ace-king, right? So the more likely your opponent has improved to a worse 2-pair by the river, the more you want to raise. Similarly, if the river is a 7, it brings in a gut shot, brings in possible set for your opponent, not as clear of a raise by the river. However, if our opponent bets small on the river and tries to block, then all of our kind of like moderate hands that check back the turn now become very, very obvious river raises, right? So this is going to be a spot where when we have a hand like ace-jack, ace-3, and even a hand as strong as ace-5, these are hands we can consider checking back in order to raise a bunch of rivers. Again, raising the river more often when it improves our opponent to a very strong second best hand. So hopefully these are 3 interesting ways that you can kind of, 1, dodge coolers a little bit more because you're being sensitive to blockers and not setting up your opponent's calling down range so that he only has hands that are better than you. For example, when you bet shove ace-3 on this spot, generally your opponent's going to show you 9s because you've blocked all the other hands that you can call you down with. and that a hand like aces or kings can check back twice on these kind of like low coordinated flops and wait for safe rivers where you can then put in the raise. Something that's also really good about raising the river is because I think most players assumed that river raises are just extremely nuts or nothing. One, people are going to be scared to put in a re-raise against you. And two, because they think that you're going to be polarized, but you've checked 2 streets, they're going to be thinking that you're polarized towards nothing, and they're just going to be, really happy to call you. So this is this kind of like weird thing where when people have like very strong hands, they don't 3-bet you on the river, right? And yet they still think that you have somehow more bluffs than usual and then are going to call you down. So it's kind of a win-win situation, gets your opponent to just kind of freeze up, and it also prevents you from having to play guessing games when the turn is kind of scary, and if you bet and get check raised, your face is just going to get blown off, right? So when you are at the bottom of the top of your range, always think about, is your hand worth like 3 full streets, or can you go for the 2.5 streets? Is your hand worth 2 full streets? If not, maybe go for the 1.5 streets. And at worst, on these really, really bad boards, if you play these kind of 1.5 hands as a single street bluff catcher, then you're playing your hand in an extremely, extremely easy way, and then showing up on the river with surprisingly strong ranges that your opponents are not going to be able to put you on. And let's be honest, the more often your opponent can't put you on a hand, the more money that you're going to make. So, hope you guys like this. Please like and subscribe as always. Check out my own personal website, overnightmonster.wise. Hope you have enjoyed this, learned a little bit, and good luck at the tables. Peace.